Getty Ministries welcomes you to Living Water. This is David Lawrence, your host for today's broadcast. Living Water is a radio program designed to provide you with sound biblical teaching that will help you claim the fullness of joy that Christ wants for His people, and as well to equip you to lead a productive Christian life. Your speaker today is Danny Hale, who will present the 8th in his series of studies on the first book of the Bible, the book of Genesis. His message today is entitled, The Flood, and he will explore with us the judgment of God upon sin and His gracious provision for salvation through the ark. We shall see how God made for Noah and his family a covenant of preservation. The flood is an event documented not only in the Bible, but also in the historical records of many countries, as well as by archaeological data. But the flood was no accident. It was the result of the spread of sin since the fall of man. Sin so widespread and pervasive that God noticed that every imagination of man was only evil continually from his youth. But the flood was not only an act of judgment, but also an act of salvation and grace. Now, let's listen to Danny Hale as he explains just how that can be true. Danny?
In our last lesson, we looked at Genesis chapters 4 and 5, where we saw a distinct theme being developed. The evil of mankind was progressive, as was demonstrated by the line of Cain. These people were technologically advanced, but they were morally depraved, as was evidenced by Lamech. There was a righteous line, however, the line given in chapter 5 as Adam's line. And the comparison between the two is too obvious not to be the intent of the writer. God's promise to Satan was being played out in the lives of men. We could at this point, though, gain the wrong impression that the whole of mankind was not so bad. Just look at the people in chapter 5. The text now gives further insight into the impact of sin on the race, and we'll see the extent of sin and God's righteous reaction to it. This is an historical account written for us, but also written to a specific audience. God's people were being led out of Egypt into the land of Canaan. The culture of that people would be a danger to the chosen people of God and His purpose for them. So these were lessons to be learned from history as Moses relates them. Let's begin in chapter 6 and verse 1. When man began to multiply on the face of the land, and the daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were attractive. And they took as their wives any they chose. Then the Lord said, My spirit shall not abide in man forever, for he is flesh. His days shall be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of man, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of his heart were only evil continually. And the Lord was sorry that He had made the man on earth, and it grieved Him to His heart. So that the Lord said, I will blot out man whom I have created from the face of the land, man and animals and creeping things and birds of the heavens, for I am sorry that I have made them. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. This particular section here, the first 8 verses of chapter 6, is perhaps the most difficult passage to interpret in all of the Pentateuch. The problem in this section obviously involves the identities of the sons of God, the daughters of men, and the Nephilim, very obscure. However, the overarching intent of the passage is not in dispute at all. The evil of mankind had reached an intolerable level in the eyes of God. The sons of God and the daughters of men, who are they? Well, there are basically 4 views. The first view is that they represent 2 lines of people, the godly and the ungodly. First we have the Sethites and the Canaanites, perhaps. The second view would be that the sons of God are angels. And thirdly, we have the sons of God being despotic rulers. And finally, it is held that the sons of God are lesser gods. The last option is, of course, based upon a view that the story of Genesis is a myth, and we can reject this position and consider the other 3. Are they angels, rulers, or saints then? St. Augustine proposed the concept that the 2 lines of people were actually the Sethites and the Canaanites, God's line and Satan's line. This was widely held among various theologians, including Luther and Calvin, and it does seem to flow from the general direction of chapters 4 and 5. It also has some credibility flowing from God's latter prohibition on his people involving marrying outside the chosen people. But there are problems with this interpretation as well. We have no reason to think that the lines of separation between the people were any better then than they are now. And there also seems to be more involved here than adulteration of God's design for marriage. Hubris is involved. And how does the Nephilim fit into this picture? Early church leaders seem to favor the interpretation that these men were angels. The sons of God were actually angels. This actually has more scriptural support than any of the other views. Sons of God is a term used in the Old Testament to refer to angels in numerous places. For example, in Job chapter 1, verse 6, again in Job 2, verse 1, and again in chapter 38, verse 7. The problems are significant, however. We have no mention of angels to this point in our narrative. And Jesus says that angels in heaven cannot marry. We see this in Matthew chapter 22 and verse 30. Bear in mind that although angels in heaven do not marry, this does not necessarily mean that angels leaving that abode cannot take on some physical form. There are 3 New Testament references to the flood that has bearing on this. 1 Peter 1, chapter 3, and verse 18 says, "For Christ died for sins once for all, the righteous for the unrighteous, to bring you to God. He was put to death in the body, but made alive by the Spirit, through whom he also went and preached to the spirits in prison, who disobeyed long ago when God waited patiently in the days of Noah while the ark was being built. In it only a few people, 8 in all, were saved through water." And then 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 4, "For if God did not spare angels when they sinned, but sent them to hell, putting them into gloomy dungeons to be held for judgment, if he did not spare the ancient world when he brought the flood on its ungodly people, but protected Noah, a preacher of righteousness, and 7 others." And then we have the reference in Jude, verse 6, "And the angels who did not keep their positions of authority, but abandoned their own home, these he has kept in darkness, bound with everlasting chains for judgment on the great day." This view is certainly possible, that these men were angels, and would give some understanding of the exceptional nature of the Nephilim, who would be the offspring. The view that the sons of God were despotic rulers does not have a great deal of textual support. But let's consider the culture of the day. The culture of the day was pagan. They had the understanding that mighty men or men of exceptional ability, particular warriors, were the offspring of gods. This is actually where the gods came from in their understanding, from marriages with humans. The religions of the land would involve sexual rituals in the temples as part of their worship. These mighty men were promiscuous, and their promiscuity was part of the decadence of the culture. It is into this culture that Moses was leading the Israelites. Moses could have been using the terminology of the day in order to communicate to them how God saw this situation. If this is correct, Moses is showing that no alleged deity will survive the judgment of God that was coming. The Nephilim, some translators render the word giants. The Revised Standard and the NIV translate it Nephilim. The intent of the word seems to be men of exceptional ability, leadership or strength, etc., and specifically refers to the improper use of those traits. Now, what do we know for sure? The moral state of mankind is repulsive to God. In verse 3, he will not contend, is sometimes rendered remain. This reminds me of Romans 1, where God gives people over to their sin. Verse 5 gives support to the concept of total depravity, doesn't it? From the last description of creation, that is, where God saw that it was very good, we have degenerated to this condition. The severe impact of sin upon mankind is the only explanation of this decline. Only evil, all the time. Verses 5 and 6 form one of the bookends of the story of God's reaction to sin. He sees the sin and determines to act in righteous judgment against it, the destruction of all living things. Society tries minimizing the impact or extent of sin, even rejecting at times its reality, but God says it is of utmost importance. His heart was filled with pain. He was grieved that he had created man. This is anthropomorphic language used to communicate the depth of the problem. It does not mean that God realized he made a mistake. It does not mean that God learned something new or was sorry for his actions. It means there is about to be a change in God's observable actions resulting from a significant change in the objects of his actions. It means to be sorry or moved with pity. It is used 33 times in the Old Testament, with God as the subject, and in each case it speaks of a change in intentions that accord with his righteous purposes and results in action commensurate with that purpose. He says man's days will be 120 years. Does that mean the length of his life? Or does that mean the time until the destruction of the earth? We have here at the end the closing line of the Toledah that was begun in chapter 5 and verse 1, and it's critically important. Noah found grace or favor in the eyes of the Lord. A word study certainly shows that this word can mean to earn one's favor when relationships between men are concerned. We see this in Genesis 39 and verse 4. But when it refers to God, it always means unmerited favor. Out of all the earth, out of all depraved mankind, including Noah, Noah found grace. Beginning in verse 9. These are the generations of Noah. Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his generation. Noah walked with God, and Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Now the earth was corrupt in God's sight, and the earth was filled with violence. And God saw the earth, and behold, it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted their way on the earth. And God said to Noah, I have determined to make an end of all flesh, for the earth is filled with violence through them. Behold, I will destroy them with the earth. Make yourself an ark of gopher wood, make rooms in the ark, and cover inside and out with pitch. This is how you are to make it. The length of the ark to be 300 cubits, its breadth 50 cubits, and its height 30 cubits. Make a roof for the ark, and finish it to a cubit above, and set the door of the ark in its side. Make it with a lower, second, and third decks. For behold, I will bring a flood of waters upon the earth to destroy all flesh, in which is the breath of life under the heaven. Everything that is on the earth shall die, but I will establish my covenant with you, and you shall come into the ark, you, your sons, your wife, and your sons' wives with you. And of every living thing of flesh you shall bring 2 of every sort into the ark to keep them alive with you. They shall be male and female. Of the birds according to their kinds, of the animals according to their kinds, of every creeping thing on the ground according to its kind, 2 of every sort shall come into you to keep them alive. Also take with you every sort of food that is eaten, and store it up. It shall serve as food for you and for them. Noah did this, and he did all that God commanded. We now see the result of God's grace. Noah was a righteous, blameless man. He walked with God, as did Enoch before him. God announced his judgment. He's going to destroy all living things on earth because of sin. In these verses, 17 through 22, we have the first mention of a covenant. It was a unilaterally established covenant and administered by God. It is bilateral in its operation. That is, in order to enjoy the blessings of salvation, you must be righteous and blameless, etc. God deals with his immediate family through this covenant as well. It has universal implications too, because all creation will be blessed through this covenant. What Noah is about to do will save all mankind. He gave directions for the means of the salvation. That would be a boat. He was to take pairs of animals on board in order to preserve them from destruction. We have some indication of God's dealing with families here, since they are saved because of Noah. Over and over again we see the refrain through the story that Noah did everything just as God commanded him. In chapter 7, verses 1 through 24, we have the absolutely amazing account of the flood, one which has generated endless debate down through time concerning its validity. But almost all cultures in history have some version of a universal flood. Even the American Indians had such a story. The most notable, though, is the Babylonian epic. There are many similarities among many of the stories to the biblical account. There is a great flood in which men and animals are saved by boarding a boat, and in over half of these stories, the story ends on a mountain. A large number include animals, birds, 8 persons, and a rainbow. But there are differences in the stories between these stories and the biblical account, and most relate to the nature of God or the gods in the secular stories. In the biblical account, the flood is a divine judgment on sin. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, for example, the reason for the flood is annoyance over the noise made by mankind. Gilgamesh, by the way, was the offspring of a god and a human. Further, the biblical ark has been proven to be extremely seaworthy, in contrast to the strange constructs of the myths. Whether you conclude that Genesis is a derivative of the myths of the day, or whether all the stories came from a passed-down version of an actual event, depends upon your faith system, doesn't it? There's a great deal of geological and archaeological evidence indicating a catastrophic event like a flood. However, it must be admitted that there's much evidence missing that should be found if the flood actually occurred. Certainly there will continue to be a debate between the scientific and theological camps. God commanded Noah and his family to enter the ark, and then he commanded the animals to enter as well. Note that it was Elohim, God, who ordered the ark to be filled, but it was Jehovah who shut them up. The flood was catastrophic. The subterranean fountains opened, as did the waters above the earth. This could be a rejoining of the waters separated on day 3 in the creation account. It is natural to treat this story as sterile or impersonal, but the human misery here is phenomenal. All life is destroyed except for the grace of God. Chapter 8 begins with the statement that God remembered Noah. When Scripture refers to God remembering, it means that there is about to be some movement of God toward the thing remembered with respect to a previous commitment, that is, his covenant. God had preserved the family of Noah, and now it was time to renew the earth through them. The ark comes to rest on the mountains of Ararat, and Noah and his family come out after being in the ark for over a year. Then Noah built an altar to the Lord and took some of every clean animal and some of every clean bird and offered burnt offerings on the altar. And when the Lord smelled the pleasing aroma, the Lord said in his heart, I will never again curse the ground because of man, for the intention of man's heart is evil from his youth. Neither will I ever again strike down every living creature as I have done, while the earth remains, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night shall not cease. Yes, salvation leads to praise and to worship, doesn't it? God had preserved the family of Noah, and now it was time to renew the earth, and Noah worshiped God. The ark had come to rest on the mountains of Ararat, and Noah and his family came out, and worship was the response. This is the only response that is proper when we have been saved by grace. The covenant is expanded in verses 20 through 22 of chapter 9, and seems to add the second bookend to our story. Again, we see God's reaction to man's evil. Never again will I curse the ground. This is reminiscent of Adam and Cain and now the post-diluvian population. To curse seems to have a broad meaning here. Never again would creation be used to punish all mankind. The reason here seems to be illogical. For every inclination of his heart is evil from childhood. The NIV and the New King James translate this as even though every inclination of his heart is evil, but the RSV and the New King James and the English Standard translate it for. I will not destroy the earth again, for every inclination of his heart is evil. This is a verification of total depravity as the result of sin. But why would that be a reason not to destroy the earth? Judgment does not remove sin. In order for that to occur, there must be time for God to work his redemptive purpose. God will preserve the earth until salvation comes in the person of Christ. And God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. The fear of you and the dread of you shall be upon every beast of the earth and upon every bird of the heavens, upon everything that creeps on the ground and all the fish of the sea. And to your hand they are delivered. Every moving thing that lives shall be food for you. As I gave you the green plants, I give you everything, but you shall not eat flesh with its life, that is, its blood. And for you, your lifeblood, I will require reckoning. From every beast I will require it, and from man. From his fellow man I will require reckoning for the life of man. Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed, for God made man in his own image. And you, be fruitful and multiply. Teem on the earth and multiply in it. Then God said to Noah and to his sons with him, Behold, I establish my covenant with you and your offspring after you, and with every living creature that is with you, the birds, the livestock, and every beast of the earth with you, as many as came out of the ark. It is for every beast of the earth. I establish my covenant with you that never again shall all flesh be cut off by waters of the flood, and never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth. And God said, This is the sign of the covenant that I make between me and you and every living creature that is with you for all future generations. I have set my rainbow in the cloud, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. When I bring clouds over the earth, and the bow is seen in the clouds, I will remember my covenant that is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh, and the waters shall never again become a flood to destroy all flesh. When the bow is in the clouds, I will see it and remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all flesh that is on the earth. God said to Noah, "This is the sign of the covenant that I have established between me and all flesh that is on the earth." We have here from chaos to cosmos, flood to order, and further development of the covenant. In chapter 9, verses 1 through 17, the covenant here takes on the characteristics of the Adamic provisions. Be fruitful and multiply in verse 1, subdue the earth in verse 2, an expansion. They are no longer vegetarians, but life must be respected. Do not eat the blood, because life belongs to God. The life of man is especially valuable. We see this in verse 6. Never again would the earth be destroyed by flood. Verse 11. And again, the universal aspect of the covenant. All creation is to be blessed. The rainbow was given as a sign of the covenant, a sacrament, if you will. Note that it is God who says he will remember his covenant when he sees it. So what is the use of the physical sign for the covenant then from man's perspective? It indicates to us that when God sees the sign, he will be faithful to his word concerning the covenant. It is not an act of faith on our part. It is a call to faith on our part, and that's what sacraments are. The Lord's Supper is the same. When we take of it, we remember Christ. It is a call to faith in him and what he did and what he will do on our behalf. It marks us as his covenant children and should move us to consider how faithful God is. In essence, when we take the Lord's Supper, two persons are remembering, God and us. So we see now the covenant of Noah fitting into God's overall process. It follows the covenant of works, which is within the covenant of redemption established in eternity. We have the covenant of works made with Adam. We have the covenant of grace announced in Genesis chapter 3. And now we have within those two covenants the covenant with Noah, supporting both. And the covenant with Noah is still in effect today, and we still are the beneficiaries of it. What were the Israelites, and what are we supposed to learn from the story of the flood? The flood and the covenant are demonstrations of God's justice, God's judgment on sin, and God's gracious salvation. 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 4 beginning. For if God did not spare angels when they sinned, but sent them to hell, putting them into gloomy dungeons to be held for judgment, if he did not spare the ancient world when he brought the flood on its ungodly people, but protected Noah, a preacher of righteousness, and 7 others, if he condemned the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah by burning them to ashes, and made them an example of what is going to happen to the ungodly. You get the point. The flood was a demonstration of God's righteous judgment upon sin. The story was meant for us to learn the nature of God and his righteous indignation, his righteous wrath that would be poured out upon the sinful. Basically, God's lesson is this: do not misinterpret my mercy and grace. Just because you see sin in this world and I do not act against it, do not think that I will overlook it. The flood is a tragic demonstration of my wrath poured out on a sinful world. Graciously, I have delayed my judgment since that time in order to provide a means of salvation for those who believe and those who obey me. But my judgment is certain. Common grace is God's providential blessings given to all mankind, as distinguished from special grace, which is given only to the elect. And there are 3 categories of common grace: universal, all creatures; general, all mankind; and covenant common grace, all within the church. What are the effects of common grace? Well, there's a stay of execution that we read here in Genesis chapter 6 and verse 3. And it also serves to restrain sin. We saw that in Genesis 3, verses 22 and 23, and again in Genesis 20, verse 6, and again in the New Testament in Romans chapter 1. But there are positive blessings. Within this universal grace, civil government is instituted to restrain evil, and all creation is blessed by rain and sunshine. But there are things common grace does not do. It does not indicate a change in God's attitude towards sin. It must be punished. And it does not ensure that covenant common grace will bring genuine conversion and thus salvation. In other words, we may be associated with the church and receive many blessings from it, but that does not mean that we are in a saving relationship with Christ. In my opinion, common grace does not enable one to view favorably God's special grace. The thought of a sovereign God angers people. The thought of his saving grace makes them even more angry. The purpose of common grace is the same as special saving grace, the glorification of God. So where is the gospel story in the story of the flood? It's here. God exercises His grace sovereignly. He elects sovereignly. He calls sovereignly. And He sanctifies sovereignly. We saw this typified by Noah here in this story. Noah is a type of Christ as our covenant head. It is through Noah that all men are saved, and it is through Christ that all men are saved from coming judgment. Also, the ark is a type of Christ as God shuts up in Him for salvation. We are all shut up in Christ for our coming salvation. And Peter likens the water of the flood to baptism. This is the deliverance before the final deliverance that we will enjoy. The story of the flood is a fabulous story, an amazing story. It was a gracious act towards us today, not just towards Noah, but it is because of God's action toward Noah that all men can be saved, because it is through Noah that the line is preserved until Christ can come, where salvation can be accomplished for all mankind, for all of God's elect, those whom He knew and those whom He loved in eternity. And all of this to the praise of His glorious grace. All of this so that we might worship Him and live for Him in grateful adoration.
Thank you, Danny. Isn't it amazing how God works, even through our sin? By now, in the book of Genesis, we have a clear picture of the effects of the fall, but we're also gaining a clearer picture of God's redemptive purposes, and all of it pointing directly toward the cross of Christ. These accounts in Genesis are not just Bible stories that we tell our children before they go to sleep at night. They have relevance to situations today and to our own salvation in Christ Jesus. You may want to obtain a copy of today's message, or perhaps the entire series of messages by Danny Hale on Genesis. In Getty Ministries has prepared this series in a package set available either in audio cassette or CD format. You may obtain single copies of any of the messages or the entire set by contacting the ministry or by ordering directly from our website. The website is engedi.org, spelled engedi.org. And while there, you may listen to or download the archived radio broadcasts. If you wish, you may contact the ministry office by telephone. Our toll-free telephone number for people living outside the Nashville area is 1-877-9-ENGETI. Or in Nashville, please call us at 793-1024. Or if you like, you may write to Engedi Ministries. Our address is 165 Blair Road, Laverne, Tennessee 37086. This is David Lawrence inviting you to join us next week. And as always, we encourage you to come to the fount of God's Word and drink deeply of the living water offered by our Lord Jesus Christ.